I want you to close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember the exact sound of a heavy cast-iron skillet heating up on a gas stove. Can you smell the faint, comforting aroma of melting butter and toasted bread drifting down the hallway of your childhood home? Think back to those chilly evenings when you would run inside from playing in the yard, your cheeks red from the cold, and the kitchen windows would be entirely fogged up from the steam of something bubbling on the stove. Today, we are going to take a journey back in time. We are going to remember 20 frugal meals we ate in 1980s America when our families had absolutely no money, but somehow we never really knew we were poor. We are going to revisit those simple, incredibly creative dishes that filled our bellies and warmed our hearts. And make sure you stay with me until the very end, because the last meal we will talk about is a deeply touching testament to the magic our mothers could create out of thin air. Before we walk into that retro kitchen, let us remember what life actually felt like back then. Time seemed to move at a completely different pace. We did not have the constant distraction of glowing screens in our pockets, rushing us through our days. We had to wait for things. We waited for our favorite television shows to air at a specific time. We waited for the dial tone on a heavy rotary phone. And we waited for our mothers to call us in for dinner. The 1980s brought some tough economic times for many American families. Factories were closing, recessions hit hard, and stretching a dollar until it screamed was an essential survival skill. Yet, there is a lingering myth today that because we lacked modern technology and endless financial resources, our lives were somehow poorer. The truth is quite the opposite. Our lives were incredibly rich in emotional connection. When the budget was painfully tight, dinner was not just about consuming calories. It was a sacred daily gathering around a scratched formica table. It was about looking at each other, sharing stories of the day, and finding true comfort in the physical presence of family. We had less in our bank accounts, but we had so much more of each other. And now, let us remember our very first dish, the humble but legendary fried bologna sandwich. Do you recall the distinct sound of that cheap slice of processed meat hitting the hot frying pan? It was an immediate, aggressive sizzle that instantly commanded your attention. If you did not cut 4 little slits around the edges, the bologna would curl up in the middle, forming a bizarre little meat cup that refused to cook evenly. The smell that filled the kitchen was overwhelmingly rich, salty, and utterly unmistakable. It smelled exactly like coming home from school on a Tuesday afternoon. We did not have the luxury of expensive deli meats, but honestly, we did not care. We would take 2 slices of plain, squishy white bread, the kind that inevitably stuck to the roof of your mouth, and spread a thin, careful layer of yellow mustard or mayonnaise across them. Placing that hot, crispy-edged circle of bologna onto the soft bread created an absolutely perfect contrast of textures. Biting into it, you felt the hot crunch of the fried edges giving way to the pillowy, cool bread. We would sit on vinyl chairs, swinging our legs, washing it all down with a tall glass of cold milk. It was a meal born out of necessity, yet it tasted like a triumph. Let us move on to a dish affectionately known by several names, but most commonly remembered as creamed chipped beef on toast. Many of our fathers remembered this from their military days, but in the 1980s it became a staple of the tight-budget household. The process was almost hypnotic to watch. It started with melting a little butter, whisking in flour until it formed a thick paste, and then slowly pouring in milk to create a rich, bubbling white gravy. Then came the star ingredient, that salty dried beef that came in a small, heavy glass jar. The meat was torn into little pieces and folded into the thick gravy, releasing its intense saltiness into the creamy sauce. The smell was dense and heavy, speaking of ultimate comfort. This steaming concoction was generously ladled over 2 pieces of heavily toasted white bread. The magic happened in the middle of the meal, when the crispy toast slowly surrendered to the hot gravy, becoming perfectly soft and savory. It was a dish that could stretch a tiny amount of meat into a meal that left you feeling completely stuffed and incredibly warm on the coldest winter nights. It was true survival food, elevated by the love of the hands that stirred the pot. We absolutely cannot forget the staple of every church potluck and late weeknight dinner, the classic tuna noodle casserole. This dish was a masterpiece of pantry diving. You would watch your mother gather the essentials, a bag of dried egg noodles, a couple of small cans of water-packed tuna, and the magic binding agent, a can of condensed cream of mushroom soup. The noodles were boiled until they were just right, then mixed with the flaked tuna, the thick soup, and maybe a handful of frozen green peas if you were feeling fancy. The sound of mixing it all together in a large glass casserole dish was distinctly squishy and wet. But the crowning glory, the element that made it truly special, was the topping. We would take a handful of plain potato chips and absolutely crush them in our hands, sprinkling the salty, greasy fragments over the top of the casserole before it went into the oven. The smell as it baked was a comforting blend of savory soup and toasted potatoes. When it emerged, bubbling around the edges with a perfectly golden crust, it was a masterpiece. The contrast between the soft, creamy noodles and the sharp crunch of the baked potato chips was a texture we still secretly crave to this very day. Sometimes the budget was so tight that breakfast became dinner, and that meant we were having cinnamon sugar toast. This was not a side dish. On some nights, it was the main event. It began with the simple act of putting generic white bread into the toaster. While it browned, you would retrieve the butter and the magical little shaker of cinnamon and sugar that seemed to live in every American cupboard. The key to perfection was speed. The moment the toast popped up, you had to spread the butter while the bread was still blazing hot. Watching the yellow square melt instantly into a golden liquid that soaked deeply into the crumb. Then came the generous shaking of the cinnamon and sugar mixture. If the toast was hot enough, the sugar would slightly caramelize, bonding with the butter to create a sweet, slightly gritty crust that was heaven to bite into. The aroma of cinnamon would fill the entire house, making a poor Tuesday night feel remarkably like Christmas morning. We would eat it leaning over the sink or sitting on the living room carpet, catching the stray sugar crystals on our fingertips. It was pennies to make, but it provided a deeply profound sense of sugary comfort when there was nothing else left in the cupboards. Another absolute titan of the frugal 1980s kitchen was American goulash, though your family might have just called it macaroni and beef. This was a one-pot wonder that seemed to multiply magically, designed specifically to feed a small army on a handful of coins. It started with browning exactly 1 pound of cheap ground beef in a massive pot, tossing in chopped white onions that sizzled and turned translucent in the rendered fat. The smell of frying beef and onions is arguably the defining scent of an American childhood. Next came the canned tomato sauce, maybe a can of diced tomatoes if they were on sale, and a hefty dash of salt and pepper. Finally, the elbow macaroni was poured directly into the sauce to cook, soaking up all that rich, meaty tomato flavor as it swelled. The pot would simmer on the stove, bubbling sluggishly, emitting puffs of savory steam that fogged the kitchen windows. When it was ladled into our bowls, it was a thick, hearty mountain of comfort. You could add a slice of cheap white bread on the side to mop up the remaining tomato sauce. That goulash tasted incredibly rich and satisfying, hiding the fact that a single pound of meat was stretched to feed 6 hungry mouths. Now, let us bring back a very specific, incredibly powerful memory. The government cheese grilled cheese sandwich. If you grew up in a certain tax bracket in the early 1980s, you knew the large, unmarked rectangular cardboard box that held a massive block of bright orange cheese. It did not melt quite like regular cheese, and it had a slightly firmer texture, but it possessed a deeply sharp, incredibly satisfying flavor. Slicing it was an event, requiring a heavy knife and a bit of elbow grease. To make the sandwich, you would butter the outside of 2 pieces of bread, place a thick slab of that government cheese in the middle, and lay it gently onto a hot skillet. The sound was a gentle, inviting sizzle. You had to press down on it with a spatula, flattening the bread until it turned a gorgeous golden brown. When you finally flipped it and the cheese began to soften and ooze just slightly over the crust, the smell was intoxicating. Biting into that sandwich provided a crunch of buttery bread, followed by the dense, salty tang of the melted cheese. It was heavily processed, entirely unnatural, and completely wonderful. For many of us, no gourmet cheese in the world will ever match the sheer comfort of that government block. When time was short and money was even shorter, our mothers turned to a classic that instantly brought smiles to our faces, affectionately known as beanie weenies. This was the ultimate marriage of 2 of the cheapest canned goods in the grocery store. You would start by taking a package of cheap hot dogs and slicing them into little round coins. The sound of the knife hitting the cutting board was rhythmic and fast. These little meat coins were thrown into a saucepan to brown slightly, releasing their savory, salty aroma into the air. Then the magic ingredient was added. A large can of baked beans was poured directly over the hot dogs. The sweet, molasses-heavy smell of the beans hitting the hot pan was instantly mouth-watering. We would stand by the stove, watching the dark brown liquid bubble and thicken, coating the hot dog slices in a sticky, sweet glaze. It was served in a simple bowl, perhaps with a solitary piece of bread to wipe the bowl clean. The combination of the sweet, soft beans and the salty, slightly chewy hot dogs was a flavor profile that felt like a grand treat. It was practically entirely devoid of nutritional value, but it was absolutely bursting with comfort and joy. In many parts of the country, especially in the South, a large pot of pinto beans and cornbread was the ultimate symbol of surviving a tough week. This meal required patience and foresight. It began the night before, when the hard-dried beans were poured into a bowl of water to soak. The next day, they were transferred to a large pot to simmer for hours. The secret to the flavor was always a piece of leftover bacon grease or a ham hock dropped directly into the boiling water. As the afternoon wore on, the house would fill with an incredibly earthy, rich, and savory aroma that wrapped around you like a warm blanket. While the beans finished cooking, the cornbread was prepared in a dangerously hot cast-iron skillet. Pouring the yellow batter into the grease produced a loud hiss, ensuring a perfectly crispy crust. When dinner was served, you would crumble the hot, slightly sweet cornbread directly into a bowl of the savory, soupy beans. The cornbread acted like a sponge, soaking up the smoky broth. Every bite was a perfect balance of textures and flavors. It was food that tied you to the earth, filling your stomach so completely that you never once thought about how little it cost to make. On freezing winter days, when the snow piled up outside and the heating bill was a source of anxiety, nothing felt quite as magical as a pot of homemade potato soup. This was a masterclass in culinary alchemy, turning a bag of cheap russet potatoes into liquid gold. You would stand beside your mother, watching her peel the rough brown skin away to reveal the pale flesh beneath. The potatoes were diced and boiled with chopped onions in a simple, milky broth, enriched by a generous knob of butter. The simmering pot produced a gentle, rhythmic, bubbling sound, and the steam rising from it smelled intensely of sweet cream and earthy potatoes. As it cooked, some of the potatoes would break down, naturally thickening the soup into a rich, velvety porridge. It was seasoned entirely with salt and heavily cracked black pepper. Sitting down to a bowl of this hot, heavy soup was like receiving a warm hug from the inside out. The soft chunks of potato melted in your mouth, and the buttery broth coated your throat. It was simple, deeply humble, and incredibly effective at keeping the winter chill and the hunger entirely at bay. Speaking of soup, we must pause to honor the timeless ritual of tomato soup with crushed saltine crackers. But we are not talking about just dipping the crackers. In the 1980s, when dinner needed to be stretched, the crackers became the meal. You would start with a can of condensed tomato soup, whisking it with milk or water until it heated through, turning a vibrant, unnatural shade of red. It was poured into your bowl, releasing that familiar, slightly metallic, sweet tomato fragrance. Then came the sleeves of saltines. We did not use just a few. We would take a huge stack of crackers and crush them directly into the hot soup, creating a thick, starchy paste. You kept adding crackers until the spoon could practically stand up straight in the bowl. The soup was no longer a liquid. It was a heavy, satisfying porridge. The salty crunch of the crackers would slowly soften as they absorbed the sweet tomato broth, creating a deeply comforting texture. Eating this required sitting in front of the television, likely watching a classic evening sitcom, feeling completely safe and warm while the wind howled outside. It cost pennies, but the sheer volume of crackers made you feel like a king. Let us turn our attention to the iconic, slightly mysterious canned meat known as Spam. For families trying to stretch a budget, Spam was an absolute lifesaver. Opening the rectangular tin was a unique ritual. You had to peel back the metal, accompanied by a distinct vacuum pop, revealing the pink block surrounded by its clear jelly. While it might look strange today, back then it was a canvas for dinner. The block was sliced into thin rectangles and placed into a hot frying pan. The transformation was incredible. The Spam would sizzle fiercely, spitting grease as the edges turned a deep, crispy brown. The smell was powerfully salty and meaty, filling the kitchen with an aroma that promised a hearty meal. We usually ate it alongside a pile of fluffy scrambled eggs, or perhaps over a mound of cheap white rice. The contrast between the incredibly crispy, salty exterior of the fried Spam and the soft, neutral rice or eggs was brilliant. It was incredibly filling, heavily preserved, and lasted forever in the pantry, waiting patiently for the days before a paycheck when the refrigerator shelves were completely bare. Sometimes the most memorable frugal meals were the sweetest. Do you remember having a bowl of warm rice with milk and sugar? This usually happened when there was a leftover container of plain white rice from the night before, sitting cold in the refrigerator. Instead of letting it go to waste, it was transformed into a magical, comforting porridge. You would scoop the cold, stiff rice into a bowl, pour cold milk over it, and add a heavy spoonful of white granulated sugar. Then it went onto the stove, or into the newly acquired microwave, to be heated until it was steaming. A tiny pat of butter was often dropped into the center, melting into a golden pool. As you stirred it, the sugar dissolved into the hot milk, and the rice absorbed the sweetness, plumping up perfectly. The smell was delicate, sweet, and milky. Eating it was soothing, almost medicinal in its comfort. It felt like eating a warm rice pudding for dinner. It was the perfect remedy for a stressful day, a rainy evening, or a tight budget, proving that immense pleasure could be found in the absolute simplest of ingredients. Another classic way to stretch a dollar was a dish consisting of only two main ingredients, elbow macaroni and canned stewed tomatoes. This was the meal you ate when there was literally no meat left in the house. A large pot of water was set to boil, and a box of cheap macaroni was dumped in. Once drained, a large can of stewed tomatoes with their soft, slippery texture and bright, acidic juice was poured directly over the hot pasta. A generous amount of salt, pepper, and perhaps a spoonful of butter was mixed in to cut the acidity. The sound of stirring this mixture was a heavy, wet slosh. The smell was purely of cooked tomatoes and starch. It was incredibly basic, yet the soft texture of the macaroni perfectly complemented the sweet, chunky tomatoes. We would eat massive bowls of it, the heat of the pasta warming us up from the inside. It was entirely uncomplicated, requiring absolutely no culinary skill, yet it managed to be deeply satisfying. It was a dish that silently communicated that we were going to be okay, that we would never go to sleep with an empty stomach. Now we must discuss the incredible art of the stretched meatloaf. A pound of ground beef naturally only goes so far, but in the hands of a resourceful 1980s mother, it could feed a massive family. The secret was the filler. You would watch as the meat was dumped into a large glass bowl, followed by the binders. But instead of just breadcrumbs, she would pour in a massive amount of rolled oats, or perhaps crushed saltine crackers. Eggs were added, along with finely minced onions and ketchup. Then came the mixing, done entirely by hand. The sound of mixing raw meat and oats was squishy and distinctive. The oats would act like little sponges, soaking up the meat juices and expanding, effectively doubling the size of the loaf. It was patted down into a heavy glass loaf pan, topped with a thick, sweet glaze of ketchup, and placed into the oven. As it baked, the smell of roasted beef, sweet caramelized ketchup, and savory onions would drift through the entire house, making your stomach rumble. The resulting meatloaf was incredibly soft, dense, and heavily flavored with the sweet crust on top. We never questioned why it was so soft. We just knew it was incredibly delicious. Let us remember the humble head of green cabbage, a vegetable that cost practically nothing, but could feed a family for days. The most popular frugal preparation was frying it down, sometimes known as haluski if you added egg noodles. The process started with a massive pile of shredded raw cabbage, which looked like it would never fit into the frying pan. But as it hit the hot butter or bacon grease, it would hiss and instantly begin to wilt. You stood over the stove, stirring continuously as the cabbage shrank, softened, and slowly turned a beautiful golden brown. The smell was incredibly earthy and savory, completely transforming the raw vegetable into something rich and sweet. If we had a few extra pennies, a sliced smoked sausage was tossed in, but often it was just the caramelized cabbage and boiled egg noodles. The soft, buttery noodles mixed with the sweet, slightly charred edges of the fried cabbage created a deeply satisfying texture. It was a heavy, rustic meal that sat warmly in your stomach. It was the food of our grandparents, passed down to help us survive the lean times, tasting of endurance and love. For a bit of absolute childhood joy, we turn to the English muffin pizza. Ordering an actual pizza delivery was a rare, expensive luxury reserved for report card days or birthdays. So, when the craving hit, our mothers improvised beautifully. A package of English muffins was split in half with a fork, preserving those glorious nooks and crannies. Each half was placed on a metal baking sheet. A small spoonful of thick tomato paste or cheap jarred spaghetti sauce was spread over the top. Then came a slice of whatever cheese was available, often just a square of processed American cheese torn into pieces, or a sprinkle of shredded mozzarella if we were lucky. A dash of dried oregano from a dusty jar completed the masterpiece. They were slid into the toaster oven, and we would watch through the little glass door as the cheese bubbled and turned slightly brown. The smell of oregano and melting cheese was incredibly exciting. Biting into it, the edges of the muffin were incredibly crunchy, while the center remained soft and soaked with the tangy sauce. It was a makeshift meal that felt like a grand party, bringing immense happiness for just a few coins. There was a very specific joy associated with a Friday night dinner consisting of frozen fish sticks and a blue box of macaroni and cheese. It was the ultimate convenience meal when the budget was stretched thin and exhaustion had set in. The fish sticks, rectangular and coated in a bright orange breading, were lined up like little soldiers on a baking sheet and shoved into the oven. Meanwhile, water boiled fiercely on the stove for the macaroni. The magic happened when you drained the tiny noodles and added that packet of neon yellow cheese powder, a splash of milk, and a lump of butter. The vigorous stirring created a highly specific squishy sound that meant dinner was almost ready. The smell was heavily processed, cheesy, and slightly fishy, but to a child in the 1980s, it was the aroma of the weekend arriving. We would dip our crispy, piping hot fish sticks heavily into ketchup and scoop up massive spoonfuls of the creamy, salty macaroni. It was entirely artificial, entirely cheap, and entirely perfect. It was a dinner that required very little effort from a tired mother, but delivered maximum comfort and satisfaction to her children. Sometimes the pantry was so bare that we had to get creative with condiments just to have a sweet treat. This brings us to the surprisingly delicious combination of peanut butter and dark pancake syrup. This was not a sandwich, it was an experience. You would take a plate and place a generous dollop of thick, sticky peanut butter right in the center. Then you would pour a heavy stream of cheap, maple-flavored corn syrup directly over it. Using a butter knife, you would furiously mix the two together until they formed a smooth, incredibly sweet, golden brown paste. The smell was intensely nutty and rich with fake maple flavor. Then you would take a single slice of cheap white bread, tear it into smaller pieces, and use it to drag through the sweet mixture, soaking up the syrup and gathering the thick peanut butter. It was messy, sticky, and completely glorious. Eating it left your fingers entirely coated in sugar. It was the ultimate dessert born out of absolute desperation, a testament to the fact that sugar and fat could fix almost any bad mood. It was our cheap, secret indulgence when the candy jar was completely empty. Another brilliant way to make a pound of ground beef feel like a feast was the creation of porcupine meatballs. This dish got its charming name from the way it looked when it was finished cooking. The raw beef was mixed not with breadcrumbs, but with a large amount of uncooked long-grain white rice, along with minced onions and salt. These were rolled by hand into tight, heavy little balls. The raw meatballs were then placed into a deep skillet and entirely covered with tomato soup or a thin tomato sauce. As they simmered slowly on the stove, the kitchen filled with the aroma of beef and sweet tomatoes. The magic happened as they cooked. The raw rice inside the meatballs absorbed the rich tomato juices, expanding and poking out of the meat in all directions, looking exactly like little porcupine quills. When served, they were incredibly soft, the rice making them tender and fluffy, completely stretching the meat. We would pour the extra tomato gravy over our plates, mashing the meatballs with our forks. It was a whimsical, creative dish that made dinner feel fun, completely hiding the fact that it was purely a budget-saving trick. Finally, we come to the most magical, chaotic, and emotionally resonant meal of them all. The end of the week. Clear out the refrigerator casserole. By Thursday or Friday night, the groceries were entirely gone, and payday had not yet arrived. Our mothers would open the refrigerator and pull out an impossible array of leftovers. A scoop of corn, a solitary hot dog, half a cup of cooked macaroni, a spoonful of peas, and maybe a tiny piece of cheese. To a child, it looked like garbage, but she would chop it all up, mix it together in a glass baking dish, bind it with whatever sauce or egg was left, top it with stale cracker crumbs, and bake it until it was bubbling. The smell was complex and unpredictable, a culmination of the entire week. When we sat down to eat it, we were not just eating random leftovers. We were consuming our mother's sheer determination. We were eating her absolute refusal to let her family go hungry. That bizarre, mismatched casserole was the physical manifestation of deep, enduring love. It taught us that as long as we were together, sitting around that table, a handful of nothing could always be transformed into something wonderful. As we look back at these 20 meals, it becomes incredibly clear that we are not just nostalgic for the food itself. We don't really miss the processed cheese or the canned meat. What we secretly miss is the profound feeling of safety that surrounded those meals. We miss our mothers standing by the stove, orchestrating miracles with a few coins and a lot of love. We miss the slow pace of those evenings, sitting shoulder to shoulder at the kitchen table, completely present with our families, unaware of the struggles our parents faced to put that food on our plates. Those frugal meals were the foundation of our youth, teaching us that true wealth is found in connection, not in money. If this journey back to the 1980s warmed your heart, please subscribe to our channel and like this video so we can continue to share these memories. And now, I want to hear from you. Which of these meals did your family eat, or what was your mother's special boot-saving recipe? Please write your personal story in the comments below, because your memories are a beautiful piece of our shared history.